I'm a funeral director at Magnolia Grove Memorial Services in Asheville, North Carolina, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 months ago. You can call me Dr. Catherine Whitmore if you want. I have my doctorate in mortuary science from the University of Cincinnati, though most families just called me Miss Catherine. During my 17 years in the funeral industry, I've handled every kind of death you can imagine: peaceful passings, tragic accidents, unexpected suicides, violent homicides, and every variation of human loss that brings families to our doors during their most devastating moments. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one family that made me question not just everything I thought I knew about death, grief, and the funeral process, but about the very nature of what separates the living from the dead. This case didn't just disturb me professionally, it terrified me on a level I didn't know was possible, changed how I view mortality itself, and ultimately led me to abandon a career I had devoted nearly 2 decades of my life to building. Magnolia Grove Memorial Services is one of the most established funeral homes in western North Carolina, serving families throughout the Blue Ridge Mountain region and into eastern Tennessee. It's a comprehensive facility that's been operating since 1892, with our own crematorium, state-of-the-art embalming preparation rooms, 4 separate chapels ranging from intimate to grand, a full-service florist, and a staff of 15 licensed funeral directors. During my career there, I personally handled over 3,200 services, consoled thousands of grieving families from every walk of life, and dealt with every conceivable circumstance surrounding death, burial, and the complex emotions that accompany loss. In the funeral industry, you learn to compartmentalize emotions very quickly, or you don't survive long in the profession. You become expertly skilled at managing your own feelings while providing comfort, guidance, and practical solutions to people experiencing the absolute worst moments of their lives. You develop professional protocols for handling unusual requests, navigating difficult family dynamics, managing suspicious circumstances, and even dealing with law enforcement when deaths involve potential criminal activity. After 17 years, I thought I had encountered every possible variation of human behavior related to death, mourning, and the rituals we create to process loss. I had worked with families from dozens of different cultural backgrounds, religious traditions, and personal belief systems. I had facilitated elaborate Orthodox Jewish preparations that required specific ritual washing and shrouding, coordinated traditional Irish wakes that lasted for days with continuous storytelling and celebration, managed Buddhist cremation ceremonies with intricate timing requirements, overseen Hindu funeral rites involving sacred fires and specific positioning of the body, and handled countless variations of Christian services from solemn Catholic masses to exuberant Southern Baptist homegoings. I had dealt with families torn apart by inheritance disputes, managed services where estranged relatives appeared after years of absence to create chaos, handled cases where the circumstances of death were so traumatic that viewing was impossible, and worked with law enforcement when deaths involved ongoing investigations. I thought I had developed the professional detachment and emotional resilience necessary to handle absolutely anything that could arise in my field. The case I'm about to describe began in what seemed like the most routine way possible, with a phone call that I initially categorized as completely standard. It started on November 3, 2023, on a foggy Friday morning, when Mrs. Isadora Blackwood called our main line at 6:45 a.m. Her voice was remarkably calm and composed, almost eerily controlled, as she explained that her mother, Cordelia Blackwood, age 73, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the family estate in the historic Montford neighborhood of Asheville. Dr. Whitmore, she said, using my formal title, which was unusual since most callers referred to me simply as Miss Catherine. I understand you handle the more specialized arrangements. My family has very particular traditions that need to be honored precisely, and I was specifically told by Dr. Margaret Hensley at Mission Hospital that you're the only funeral director in the region who has the expertise and discretion to help us navigate our requirements. Hensley was a respected physician who had referred several families to me over the years, particularly those with complex medical or cultural needs, so this reference gave me confidence that I was dealing with a legitimate and potentially challenging case. Many families do have cultural, religious, or personal practices that require special accommodation, and I had extensive experience working with diverse traditions and unusual requests. Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, I replied, settling into my office chair and opening a new case file on my computer. We're very experienced with traditional and cultural requirements, as well as personal family preferences. Can you tell me a bit about what your family needs for Mrs. Cordelia's services? We'll need an extended period for our observances, she said, her voice maintaining that same eerily controlled tone. Mother will need to be prepared in a very specific manner, and the family will be conducting private ceremonies each evening for 9 consecutive nights before the burial. There are 6 of us children, plus several grandchildren, and we each have particular responsibilities that must be completed in the correct sequence according to our family traditions. A 9-day observance period wasn't entirely unusual, though it was on the longer side of what I typically encountered, and would require very careful embalming and preservation techniques to maintain the body's appearance and prevent deterioration. Jewish Shiva traditionally lasts 7 days. Some Orthodox traditions extend longer, and I had worked with families who held extended wakes for various cultural reasons. That can certainly be arranged, Mrs. Blackwood, I said, making notes about the timeline. We'll need to discuss the specific preparation requirements to ensure your mother looks her best throughout the extended viewing period. When would be convenient for you to come in to discuss the details and complete the necessary paperwork? This afternoon would be preferable, she replied. We'd like to have Mother transferred to your facility tomorrow morning, so that preparations can begin immediately. Time is somewhat critical for our traditions. I scheduled an appointment for 3 p.m. that afternoon, and provided Mrs. Blackwood with the basic information she would need about required documentation, death certificates, and the logistics of transferring her mother's body from their home to our preparation facility. The call seemed completely professional and routine, though I did make a note about the extended timeline, so I could research any specific cultural traditions that might be relevant. When Mrs. Isadora Blackwood arrived at our facility that Friday afternoon, she was accompanied by 5 other adults, 3 women, and 2 men, who she introduced as her siblings. All appeared to be in their 40s and 50s, well dressed in expensive but understated clothing, and carried themselves with the kind of quiet dignity I often saw in families from old Asheville society, who had been dealing with wealth and social expectations for generations. What struck me immediately, however, was their unusual collective composure. In my 17 years of experience, even families from cultures that celebrate death rather than simply mourn it, even families who have been expecting a death for months due to terminal illness, even families who possess strong religious faith about afterlife and eternal rest, still show some visible signs of grief, stress, emotional strain, or the simple exhaustion that accompanies managing death arrangements while processing loss. The Blackwood family displayed absolutely none of these typical human reactions. They were polite, articulate, and spoke in carefully measured tones about their mother's arrangements. They answered my questions with precise, detailed responses. They handled the paperwork efficiently, and seemed well prepared for the administrative aspects of funeral planning. But there was something almost performative about their interactions, as if they were playing the roles of grieving family members, rather than actually experiencing the emotions that typically accompany the loss of a parent and grandmother. Dr. Whitmore, Mrs. Blackwood said as we settled into our largest conference room, which I used for families requiring extended consultations, I need to be completely transparent with you about our requirements. Our family practices are, let's say they're quite specific and not typical of mainstream funeral traditions, but they are absolutely essential for Mother's proper transition and our family's spiritual obligations. She opened an elegant leather portfolio, and withdrew a set of handwritten documents that looked like they had been prepared by a lawyer, or perhaps copied from much older papers. The handwriting was precise and formal, and she handed me a detailed list of specifications that was unlike anything I had encountered in 17 years of funeral service. The list included highly specific positioning requirements for the body, with precise angles for the head, arms, and hands. It detailed unusual lighting arrangements for the viewing room, requiring particular types of bulbs, specific brightness levels, and even the exact colors of light that needed to be present at different times of day. It specified particular flowers that needed to be present in exact quantities and arrangements, including some varieties that I would need to special order from suppliers in other states. Most unusually, the family requested an intricate schedule of private communions that would occur at specific times throughout each of the 9 days, with different family members taking turns in what they described as maintaining the connection during Cordelia's transition period. But the most striking requirement was that Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood's eyes remain open during all viewings, ceremonies, and family visits. In mortuary science, we typically close the eyes of the deceased for obvious aesthetic reasons and to provide comfort for family members and visitors. Keeping eyes open requires special techniques, can be quite unsettling for most people, and often becomes more difficult to maintain as time passes. Mrs. Blackwood, I said carefully, reviewing the detailed requirements, some of these requests are quite unusual, but we can certainly accommodate them with proper preparation and planning. However, I want to make sure you and your family understand that keeping the eyes open during extended viewing can be quite intense for visitors and family members. Many people find it unsettling. The youngest of the siblings, who had introduced herself as Evangeline Blackwood, spoke for the first time since arriving. Dr. Whitmore, our mother needs to observe our ceremonies during her transition. It's essential that she witness each of our tributes and contributions to her journey. Our family traditions require her active participation in the process. The phrasing struck me as distinctly odd. In all my experience with diverse cultural traditions, extensive research into funeral customs from around the world, and consultation with religious leaders from many different faiths, I had never encountered beliefs that required the deceased to literally witness ceremonies or participate in their own funeral process. The language suggested a level of consciousness or awareness that was inconsistent with death as I understood it.
I see, I said, making notes about their specific requirements, while trying to maintain professional neutrality. We'll need to bring your mother in tomorrow for preparation. The preservation techniques required for a 9-day viewing period are quite complex and need to begin as soon as possible. Mrs. Blackwood nodded approvingly. There are a few additional requirements we should discuss, Dr. Whitmore. During our private communion periods each evening, roughly from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., we'll need absolute privacy in the viewing room and the surrounding areas. No staff should be present anywhere in the building during those hours, and we'll need assurance that the facility is completely secure and free from interruption. This request wasn't entirely unusual, though the extended time period was longer than most families required. Many families prefer complete privacy during their vigils, prayers, or personal ceremonies, and our facility was designed to provide that level of solitude when requested. However, 4-hour periods of exclusive access for 9 consecutive nights was more extensive than typical arrangements. We can certainly arrange that, I said. We'll coordinate with our security service to ensure the building is properly secured while giving your family the privacy you need. We spent the next hour working through financial arrangements, completing required paperwork, and discussing the logistics of the extended viewing period. The Blackwood family was obviously well prepared and financially comfortable. They requested our most comprehensive service package, premium embalming options, and additional preservation treatments without any discussion of cost limitations. As we prepared to conclude the meeting, I noticed something that would later become significant. As the family prepared to leave, each member took a different route through our facility toward the main entrance. Rather than walking together as a group, they separated and individually explored different areas of the building, the various chapels, the preparation areas that were visible to families, the corridors connecting different sections of the facility, At the time, I attributed this to natural curiosity about where their mother's services would be held, and a desire to familiarize themselves with the space where they would be spending considerable time over the following 9 days. Families often want to visualize how ceremonies will unfold and feel comfortable in the environment where they'll be grieving and remembering their loved one. But there was something methodical about their individual exploration of the building, systematic, thorough, almost like a professional assessment of the facility's layout, security features, and potential access points. Each sibling seemed to be memorizing specific details about different areas of the building, rather than simply getting oriented to the space. The oldest brother, who had introduced himself as Thaddeus Blackwood, spent several minutes examining the security cameras in our main hallway and asked specific questions about our alarm system and after-hours protocols. At the time, I explained this as the natural concern of a family member who wanted to ensure their loved one would be safe and secure during the extended viewing period. Evangeline spent considerable time in our largest viewing room, walking the perimeter and noting the locations of electrical outlets, lighting controls, and ventilation systems. She asked detailed questions about the room's capacity, acoustics, and whether we had any restrictions on family activities during private viewing periods. The middle sister, Serafina, examined our preparation areas with what seemed like professional knowledge, asking technical questions about embalming procedures, preservation methods, and the equipment we used for extended-term body maintenance. Her questions were so detailed and knowledgeable that I wondered if she had medical training or experience in the funeral industry. After the family left, I spent considerable time that evening researching funeral traditions that might explain the Blackwood family's specific requirements. I searched through my extensive professional library, consulted online databases of cultural and religious practices, and even contacted colleagues who had experience with unusual family traditions. I found references to various extended mourning periods in different cultures, historical practices related to ancestor veneration, and some traditional beliefs about the deceased needing to approve of their funeral arrangements. However, I couldn't find any established cultural tradition that specifically required keeping the deceased's eyes open so they could witness ceremonies or participate in their own transition process. The closest practices I could identify were certain Native American traditions involving communication with the deceased, some African customs related to ancestral guidance, and historical European beliefs about the dead providing protection or blessing to their families. But none of these typically involved the physical presence of the body, with eyes open during extended ceremonies. I also researched the Blackwood name in local historical records, since they had mentioned family traditions and seemed to be from an established Asheville family. What I found was intriguing, but not necessarily relevant to their funeral requirements. The Blackwood family had been in the Asheville area since the late 1800s, with records showing their involvement in various business ventures including timber, mining, and real estate development. They had owned considerable property in the mountains surrounding Asheville and had been associated with several local institutions and charitable organizations over the decades. However, I also found some unusual references in historical newspapers and local archives. There were occasional mentions of the Blackwood family in connection with private societies and exclusive gatherings that seemed to be more than typical social events. Some articles from the 1920s and 1930s referenced speculation about unconventional practices and mysterious activities at the Blackwood estate, though nothing specific or substantiated was ever reported. Still, I had learned over the years that many old Southern families have adapted traditional practices to their own beliefs, combined elements from different cultural backgrounds, or developed unique family customs that may seem unusual to outsiders, but are meaningful and important to the family members themselves. The Blackwood family's requests were certainly unusual but not impossible to accommodate professionally. On Saturday morning, November 4th, I arrived at the funeral home early to oversee Cordelia Blackwood's transfer and begin the complex preparation process that would be required for the extended viewing period. Our transport team brought the body from the family estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion in Montford that I recognized as one of the neighborhood's most impressive historical properties. When I began my initial examination to assess what would be required for 9 days of preservation, I encountered the first truly unusual aspect of the case. Cordelia Blackwood appeared to be a woman in her early 70s, approximately 5'6" inches, with an elegant bearing that was apparent even in death. According to the death certificate signed by her longtime physician, Dr. Robert Sterling, she had died of natural causes related to complications from diabetes and heart disease, which was consistent with her known medical history. However, what I found remarkable was Mrs. Blackwood's exceptional physical condition for someone who had supposedly died of medical complications related to chronic illness. Her skin tone was remarkably good, with none of the pallor, discoloration, or settling that typically occurs in the hours after death. Her muscle tone was surprisingly preserved, without the relaxation and post-mortem changes that I would normally expect to see. Most unusually, her body temperature seemed higher than typical for someone who had been deceased for approximately 12 hours. While this could sometimes occur depending on environmental factors or the circumstances of death, it was notable enough that I made specific observations in my preparation notes. I initially attributed these observations to the possibility that the family had maintained optimal environmental conditions at their home and called us very quickly after Cordelia's passing. Proper temperature control and rapid professional intervention can sometimes preserve these physical characteristics better than cases where there are delays between death and professional care. I proceeded with the embalming process, using the most advanced preservation techniques and specialized chemical solutions available for extended viewing periods. This involved multiple types of preservative fluids, arterial injection at several different points, careful attention to facial features and coloring, and additional treatments specifically designed to maintain appearance and prevent deterioration over an extended period. From a technical standpoint, everything appeared normal, and Mrs. Blackwood's body responded to the embalming process exactly as expected. The chemical solutions circulated properly, the preservation effects were evident, and I was confident that she would maintain an appropriate appearance throughout the 9-day viewing period. But as I worked through the several hours of preparation procedures, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease that I had never experienced in thousands of previous cases. It wasn't anything I could identify specifically. The body was responding normally to treatment. The family's requests were unusual but not unprecedented, and the death appeared to be straightforward from a medical perspective. Yet there was something about the entire situation that felt fundamentally wrong, a subtle but persistent sense of wrongness that seemed to intensify as I worked. It was as if some instinct I had developed over 17 years was trying to warn me about something, though I couldn't rationally identify what that something might be. When I positioned Mrs. Blackwood's eyes to remain open according to the family's specifications, the effect was remarkably lifelike, almost unsettlingly so. The combination of her naturally well-preserved features, the specialized embalming techniques, and careful attention to facial positioning created an appearance that seemed less like death and more like someone who was simply resting with their eyes open. I completed the preparation process by Saturday afternoon, and Mrs. Blackwood was moved to our largest viewing room, arranged according to the family's detailed specifications. The lighting was adjusted to their exact requirements, with special bulbs providing the specific colors and brightness levels they had requested. The particular flowers they had ordered, some quite rare and expensive varieties, were arranged in the precise quantities and positions outlined in their written instructions. When I stepped back to review my work, I was struck by how extraordinarily lifelike Cordelia Blackwood appeared. The viewing room, with its customized lighting and carefully arranged flowers, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. Mrs. Blackwood looked as if she could see everything happening around her, as if she was consciously observing her own funeral preparations. It was, I realized, exactly the effect the family had been requesting. Cordelia Blackwood appeared ready to witness the ceremonies her children had planned and to participate in her own transition process, whatever that meant in their family traditions. The Blackwood family's first private communion was scheduled for Saturday evening from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. As requested, I ensured that all staff had left the building by 9:30 p.m. and that our security service was informed about the family's exclusive access period. I locked the facility and provided Mrs. Blackwood with the security codes and keys she would need for entry. As I prepared to leave for the evening, I noticed that the family had already arrived and were entering through the main entrance. What struck me was that they were carrying several bags and cases that seemed too large for typical funeral visiting, more like equipment or supplies for some kind of extended activity.
I also noticed, though I didn't think much of it at the time, that a second vehicle arrived just as I was pulling out of the parking lot, a dark van with tinted windows that parked in the rear service area of our building rather than in the main visitor parking area. That detail would later become crucial to understanding what was really happening during those 4-hour private communion periods, and why the Blackwood family had been so specific about their privacy requirements and their mother's need to witness their activities. But at the time, I drove home thinking about nothing more than the technical challenges of maintaining Cordelia's appearance for the remaining 8 days of viewing, completely unaware that I had just left 6 people alone in my funeral home, who were about to begin doing something that would fundamentally change my understanding of life, death, and the boundaries between the two. On Sunday morning, November 5th, I arrived at Magnolia Grove Memorial Services at 7 a.m. to check on the arrangements and ensure everything was proceeding normally after the Blackwood family's first private communion. What I discovered when I entered the viewing room would haunt me for the rest of my life. The room itself appeared exactly as I had left it. The lighting was still adjusted to the family's specifications, the rare flowers were still arranged in their precise positions, and Cordelia Blackwood lay exactly where I had positioned her. But something was fundamentally different, something that defied every principle of mortuary science I had learned over 17 years of practice. Cordelia Blackwood's eyes, which I had carefully positioned to remain open using specialized techniques and medical adhesives, were not just open, they were tracking my movement as I entered the room. When I approached her casket from the left side, her gaze shifted to follow me. When I moved to the right side, her eyes moved with me. When I stood directly at the foot of the casket, she appeared to be looking directly at me with an expression of conscious awareness that was absolutely impossible. I stood frozen for several minutes, convinced I was experiencing some kind of optical illusion or stress-related hallucination. In mortuary science, there are occasionally post-mortem muscle spasms that can cause slight movements, but nothing that could account for the deliberate, coordinated eye movements I was witnessing. The dead do not track movement. The dead do not maintain eye contact. The dead do not appear conscious, but Cordelia Blackwood was doing all of these things. I immediately called Dr. Robert Sterling, the physician who had signed her death certificate, and asked him to meet me at the funeral home for an emergency consultation. When he arrived 30 minutes later and examined Cordelia, his face went completely pale. "Catherine," he said, using my first name despite our typically formal professional relationship, "I've been practicing medicine for 32 years. I signed this woman's death certificate myself after confirming she had no pulse, no breathing, and no neurological responses. She was clinically dead by every medical standard. But what I'm seeing now," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Doctor," Sterling used his stethoscope to check for a heartbeat. Nothing. He checked for breathing. Nothing. He tested reflexes and neurological responses using standard medical procedures. Nothing. By every conventional measure, Cordelia Blackwood was deceased exactly as she had been when he pronounced her dead 48 hours earlier, except for her eyes, which continued to follow our movements around the room with unmistakable intelligence and awareness. "We need to call the authorities," Dr. Sterling said. "This situation is beyond anything in my medical experience." But before I could respond, Mrs. Isadora Blackwood arrived for what she described as a morning consultation with her mother. When she saw Dr. Sterling and me standing beside the casket with obvious distress, her composed demeanor finally cracked slightly. "Dr. Whitmore," she said slowly, "I can see that you've discovered our family's particular situation. We had hoped it wouldn't manifest quite so obviously during the viewing period." "What situation?" I demanded, my professional composure completely shattered. "Your mother is dead, but she's somehow still conscious. This is medically impossible, and frankly, it's terrifying." Isadora looked at her mother's body, and I swear I saw Cordelia's eyes shift to focus on her daughter's face. "Dr. Whitmore, our family has a very unusual medical condition. It's genetic. It's been documented in our bloodline for over 150 years, and it's the reason we require such specific funeral arrangements." She explained that the Blackwood family suffered from what she called suspended mortality, a condition where death occurred normally by all medical standards,
but consciousness somehow persisted for a limited period afterward. The 9-day viewing period wasn't about family traditions. It was the time required for this consciousness to fully transition and for true death to occur. The private communions each night, she continued, allow us to communicate with our family member during their transition period. They can see, they can hear, and in some cases, they can even provide guidance about family matters that need to be resolved before their final departure. Dr. Sterling and I stared at her in complete disbelief. What she was describing wasn't just medically impossible, it challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and consciousness itself. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Sterling said, I need to understand what you're telling us. Are you saying your mother is somehow still alive, despite being clinically dead? Not alive, Isadora corrected, but not entirely gone either. It's a state between life and death that our family experiences. It's why we've always been so private about our funeral practices, and why we needed a funeral director who could handle unusual circumstances with discretion. Over the following 3 days, I witnessed things that fundamentally changed my understanding of mortality. Each morning, Cordelia's awareness seemed slightly diminished compared to the previous day, as if her consciousness was gradually fading. Her eye movements became less responsive, her apparent attention span decreased, and the sense of active intelligence behind her gaze slowly diminished. But during those 3 days, she was undeniably aware. When family members spoke to her during visiting hours, her eyes would focus on their faces. When they asked her yes or no questions, she would blink once for yes and twice for no with remarkable consistency. When they discussed family memories, her facial expression would change subtly, as if she was experiencing emotions related to the stories being shared. The most disturbing experience occurred on Wednesday evening, November 8th. I had decided to stay late at the funeral home to observe one of the family's private communion sessions, hidden in an adjacent room, where I could see into the viewing room without being detected. What I witnessed was unlike anything I could have imagined. The 6 Blackwood siblings arranged themselves in a circle around their mother's casket, each holding candles and speaking in a language I didn't recognize, not Spanish, not Latin, but something that sounded ancient and formal. As they spoke, Cordelia's eyes moved from sibling to sibling, as if she was actively participating in the conversation. At one point, Isadora asked her mother a direct question about the location of important family documents. Cordelia blinked once for yes, when Isadora mentioned specific locations, eventually indicating a hiding place that the family had apparently been searching for since her death. But the most chilling moment came when Evangeline asked, "Mother, can you see the funeral director watching us from the next room?" Cordelia's eyes immediately shifted to look directly at the doorway, where I was hidden, and she blinked once. Yes, I fled the building immediately, and didn't return until the following morning. On Friday, November 10th, the 7th day of the viewing period, Cordelia's awareness had diminished significantly. Her eyes still moved occasionally, but without the focused intelligence of the previous days. She no longer seemed to track conversations or respond to direct questions. It was as if her consciousness was finally fading toward true death. On Sunday, November 12th, the 9th and final day, I arrived to find the Blackwood family conducting what they called the final transition ceremony. When I checked on Cordelia, after they finished, her eyes had finally closed, and there was no longer any sign of awareness or consciousness. She appeared to be truly, completely dead, for the first time since I had begun caring for her body. The family held a traditional burial service that afternoon, and Cordelia Blackwood was interred in the historic Riverside Cemetery, but the damage to my psychological state was already complete. For months afterward, I found myself questioning every aspect of my profession. How many other families might have similar conditions that I had dismissed as grief-induced imagination? How many times might I have buried someone who was still conscious in some way? What did this experience mean for our understanding of death, consciousness, and the boundary between life and whatever comes after? I began having nightmares about conscious corpses, about families with terrible secrets, about the possibility that death wasn't the definitive end I had always believed it to be. I started avoiding eye contact with the deceased during preparation, terrified that I might see signs of awareness that I had previously missed or ignored. 6 months after the Blackwood case, I realized I could no longer function as a funeral director. How could I provide families with certainty about death and burial when I had witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about mortality? I submitted my resignation from Magnolia Grove Memorial Services and moved to a small town in Vermont, where I now work as a grief counselor for families dealing with loss. It's meaningful work, but I deliberately avoid any direct contact with the deceased. The Blackwood family sends me a card every year on the anniversary of Cordelia's death, thanking me for my discretion and professionalism during their difficult time. They've never offered additional explanations about their family condition, and I've never asked for any. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself researching genetic conditions, consciousness studies, and the medical mysteries that science hasn't yet explained. I've found scattered references to similar phenomena in medical literature: rare cases of prolonged consciousness after clinical death, families with unusual death-related experiences, and conditions that challenge our understanding of when life actually ends. The case of Cordelia Blackwood remains the most unexplained and unsettling experience of my professional life. It taught me that death, for all our medical advances and scientific understanding, still contains profound mysteries that we've barely begun to explore. Most importantly, it reminded me that there are aspects of human existence that transcend our current knowledge, and that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are hidden within families who have learned to live with the impossible. I still don't understand what I witnessed during those 9 days in November 2023. I don't know if the Blackwood family's condition is medical, supernatural, or something else entirely, but I know that it changed my fundamental understanding of life, death, and consciousness in ways that I'm still processing years later. And sometimes, when I'm working with grieving families in my current practice, I find myself wondering, what if their loved ones can still hear them? What if consciousness persists in ways we don't understand? What if the Blackwood family's experience isn't as unique as I want to believe? These questions will haunt me for the rest of my life, serving as a constant reminder that human existence contains mysteries far more profound and terrifying than most of us ever imagine.